Welcome, everybody, here to this event tonight. So good to see so many good people, because frankly, who likes being bad in this world that we live in? Frankly, nobody. So obviously, everyone in here is a good person. And really, tonight is about trying to ensure that that goodness goes to the most effective outlets, which I'm sure is important for all of us. Now, it's quite interesting. We do spend an awful lot of money being good. And before I came here, I just had a look at some of the statistics for how much we do spend being nice to the rest of the world. And I looked at the Charities Aid Foundation, who do an annual report on how much we give. 8 out of 10 of us over the last year participated in some form of charitable giving or charitable event. The typical monthly amount that we give to charities is £14. The estimated total amount we give to charity over the whole year, the whole of the UK, £10.6 billion. Now that's how much we give. Obviously we volunteer, we give charity shops bad cardigans, rubbish shoes, and that makes us feel better because we are handing on our goods in a very nice way. And so it's clear that we give an awful lot. But how many of us test in any way, shape, or form where that money goes, how effective the outcomes of that giving are? In order of preference, according to the Charities Aid Foundation, we give to medical research first. 33% of us give to some form of medical charity, followed by children and young people, because they have particularly big eyes, and hospitals and hospices. That often comes from the fact that lots of us are touched by tragedy, and particularly by the death of a relative, and that often sparks the giving instinct. But the notion is, I think, tonight is about how much research do we do on where that money goes, because it's a lot of money. And if it's £10.6 billion in the UK, it's many multiples of that across the Western world, of course, and particularly in America, where philanthropy is a much bigger industry than it is here, although the industry of giving is growing in the UK. Do we do more research on where we might go for dinner tonight? What hotel we might pick in the Mediterranean for our holidays than where our average £14 a month goes? And before I introduce my tremendously brainy panelists, I just want to ask a little question of all of us in here so that we can all see just how good we are. This is obviously not a very representative audience. The fact that you're here shows that you are engaged in this debate, and clearly that is different from the general populace. My two speakers, William MacAskill, on my right, is the Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford, co-founder of the Effective Altruism movement, and of 2 non-profit organizations, Giving What We Can and 80,000 Hours. They're 2 organizations that try and give people a sort of blueprint, I suppose, for how to use their time and money effectively as possible to fight some of the world's kind of most pressing issues that we're here to discuss. He has pledged to donate everything you earn above £20,000 to charities, to organizations, may not be charities, he believes will do the most good. Will, welcome.
Thank you.
To my left, Giles Fraser, parish priest at St Mary's Newington in South London. More famously, of course, he was the Canon Chancellor of St Paul's Cathedral until he resigned in 2011 over the treatment of the Occupy protesters camped outside the cathedral. He writes the loose canon column for The Guardian and is a regular colleague of mine, broadcasting on Radio 4. Will has written a brilliant book, which I have read. And I'm going to talk to you, Will, about that to kick ourselves off for the first few minutes. I will be coming to the audience for comments, thoughts, opinions, questions, actually, more so, as this event progresses. So, Will, you're obviously someone who wanted a quiet life. Here are some of the arguments from your book. Giving to disaster relief is not the best way to help. Buying sweatshop-produced goods is a good thing. Buying Fairtrade achieves little. Typical charities do 100 times less good than the best charities. Don't give to developed world cancer charities. I slightly paraphrased that last one, but I'm a journalist, so. Will, what do you mean by effective altruism?
So effective altruism is about using your time and money as effectively as possible to make the world a better place. It's about going with high-quality evidence, careful reasoning, and in-depth research to make your decisions, rather than merely going with kind of what's emotional or what's sexy at the time. So to illustrate this in the book, I talk about difference between a program called the Play Pump, which everyone thought was going to be this amazing revolution within development. It was a children's merry-go-round that would pump clean water up from the ground, providing water for the people of the village. So it was meant to be like a win-win. Children would get their first playground amenity, and people of the village would get water for their basic needs. And the only problem was that it was an absolutely terrible idea. So despite this huge amount of media hype, tens of millions of dollars that went into funding, it was an absolute disaster from the start. Even though, unlike normal merry-go-rounds, which you push them and they spin freely, these require constant torque in order to pump the water. Children would get very tired and therefore wouldn't want to pump the water all day. It was left up to the elderly women of the village to push these things. They'd find this incredibly dignified, very undemeaning. In some villages, children were paid to push the pumps. They'd also sometimes fall off and break limbs and sometimes vomit from the spinning. What's more, the people of the communities had never been asked whether they actually wanted these things. And when they were consulted, they said they much preferred the boring and unsexy but functional Zimbabwe hand pumps that they'd replaced. And all of this cost 3 times the amount of the hand pumps that they'd replaced, producing smaller amounts of water. And thankfully, all this came to light. And the Case Foundation and other sponsors actually withdrew their funding, though the organization does still continue in a diminished capacity. So that was a program that got a huge amount of attention, but actually wasn't a very good idea at all. And we can contrast this with something you might not have heard about, which is deworming school children. So over 1 billion people actually suffer from intestinal worms that don't kill as many people as malaria or tuberculosis or HIV/AIDS, but they make the lives of many people, and especially children, sick. And a couple of economists went to sub-Saharan Africa, and rather than thinking, okay, we actually want to just implement what we think is going to be a great idea, textbooks, they went and tested a number of different things. Actually found that textbooks didn't have an impact. They found that reducing class sizes didn't have an impact. But providing these incredibly cheap drugs, only about 30 pence per person, and distributing them en masse to all the children in the community via schools, they could drastically improve school attendance rates, and when they followed up 10 years later, significantly improve economic outcomes, number of hours worked and the amount these people were earning. So this, talking about worms is not a sexy thing to talk about. It's kind of gross, it's kind of boring, but actually it's, despite being one of the least sexy development interventions, it's actually this astoundingly powerful way to do good. So the idea of effective altruism is, both with our time and our money, how can we avoid being like play pumps and instead try and do things like deworming, the things that really work as well as possible?
Well, it's very interesting reading the play pumps example in your book, which you tell in a brilliant way, is the idea that it took off sort of politically, celebrity endorsements, for a long time before anyone seemed to bother actually testing the outcomes.
Yeah.
And I think it was UNICEF in the end that did the research that showed all the problems you say happened. Talk us through why it is that we will commit often large amounts of money to projects of that type without doing any form of testing of whether or not the outcomes are likely to be good ones.
Great. So there's a couple of things going on. One is that there's this structural problem when it comes to doing good, which is a lack of feedback mechanisms. So if you buy a really lousy laptop, then you get it in the mail and you see, okay, no, this was an awful product. You get to know immediately what you've bought, and you can assess whether that was worth your money or not. When it comes to donating, you just give the money to this organization. You have to put all your faith that they're going to use that money well. You never really find out what that money was used for. So if it was used badly or used very well, you never know. And that means it's possible for organizations like the Play Pump to keep going without people ever realizing that actually this is a very bad use of money. So the people spending the money are different from the beneficiaries, and that's a problem when it comes to learning. And the second thing I think is just often people really don't know just how much of a discrepancy there is between different ways of doing good. I think people often think making a difference could be easy because if you've got good intentions, that's what is going to produce good outcomes. Whereas I think that's just very often not the case. In fact, about 75% of social programs, when tested, are found to have no effect at all. And even within those that work, there's discrepancies of something like a factor of 100 between the ones that merely work well and the ones that are really the very best. And this is very counterintuitive. And so I think that's something that people neglect or haven't really thought about when it comes to doing good.
Well, in the book, you give sort of 3 rules, really, for how to at least test what you are doing and what you are giving does reach the bar of what you describe as effective altruism. Talk us through those three rules.
Terrific. So the first is asking yourself the question, how many people am I going to benefit and by how much? So you might think, well, it's just impossible to compare different ways of doing good, different forms of charity, and so on. But there's one thing that all this really bottoms out on, which is improvements in people's lives. So if you can save 100 people's lives, that's better than saving one person's life. If you can prevent someone from becoming severely disabled, that's better than preventing someone from getting a migraine for some time. And economists have used this kind of basic insight or intuition and built it into a metric that's called the quality-adjusted life year. It's a very boring term, but the idea is just that you can improve someone's life in 2 ways. If they have a happy, healthy life, you can extend their life while they are alive, or what we call saving someone's life. Really, we've never ever saved someone's life because people always die at some point. The second way in which you can improve someone's life is just to improve their quality of life while they are alive. And using this metric, you can look at different sorts of programs and assess how big is the impact of this program on people's lives. And that brings us to the second question, which is this the most effective thing I can do? Because people often think, well, as long as you're making a difference, that's what's important. There's this very common slogan, making a difference. But even among things that work very well, there's a massive discrepancy in what works well and what works extremely well. So if you provide a treatment for Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a type of cancer, skin cancer, that you can get if you've got HIV and it defines you having AIDS, that'll cost about £20,000 to give one person the equivalent of 1 year of very high-quality health. You can do that same amount of good with only £100 by distributing long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets. So there's a factor of 100 here between 2 things that are both well worth funding, both doing good, measurably. But by distributing bed nets, you're having 100 times as much impact measured in terms of improvements of people's lives. So the final question then is this area neglected? And this is because, in general, things just have diminishing marginal returns. So your first Cadbury's cream egg is delicious. Your fourth really starts to make you feel sick. Money, if you're very poor, is worth a lot more than money if you're very well off. And that actually becomes very powerful because it means often following the crowd is exactly what you don't want to do when it comes to doing good. And this relates, so Kamal mentioned disaster relief, for example. So obviously I think that disaster relief should be funded. Obviously I think it's very important. But the issue is just that it gets far more funding than what I'd call ongoing natural disasters. Things like the 400,000 people who die from malaria, or the hundreds of thousands of people who die from tuberculosis or HIV/AIDS. They get a lot less attention, a lot less publicity, and so therefore don't get the same amount of funding. And that means that you can do a lot more good by targeting them. You'll have a bigger impact measured in terms of improvements to people's lives than if you were to fund most disaster relief programs.
Does that mean, Will, that we should all just simply give money to malarial bed net charities?
So the question, this is another important issue, is the question of what am I going to do on the margin, given how everyone else is acting, versus what would happen if everyone did this? Because I think we often think, well, what would if everyone did that? Neglecting the fact that, most of the time, most people aren't going to do this. So if it were the case that I could wave a magic wand, or I was just very persuasive, and everyone in the UK started following my advice, then of course we'd have to broaden out beyond malaria. So Against Malaria Foundation, one of the charities that I recommend very highly, they have room for more funding, the amount of money they could plausibly cope with of about £15 million. UK giving would easily swamp that, and so we'd need to move on to the next most effective thing after that, and the next most effective thing after that. But given that other people aren't doing that, given that Against Malaria Foundation still has this funding need, then I think that, yeah, pretty much you as an individual should just give all of your donations
so your lack
to that best place.
Your lack of persuasive ability means that we should be giving to malarial charities until you've convinced enough of us, and then we can stop and move on to the next one down the list.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Fabulous, okay, well. So, Giles, being effective when doing good is a good thing.
Is that a question?
No, it's a statement. I have no opinions as a member of the BBC. I'm just saying, just putting Will's point, is better than just simply putting money in things with no notion of what the effectiveness of that money is. But Giles, some people might say that the whole point of altruism is that it doesn't fit very neatly into economists' spreadsheets and Edexcel outputs about cost-benefit analysis, and that altruism is a human instinct. Giles, how do you react to Will's overarching argument that unless it's effective, you are wasting that altruistic instinct?
I don't like arguing with Will, because Will's a saint, and there's nothing to be had with, there's no upside to arguing with someone as good and saintly and as interesting as Will. And I said to him in the green room before, I said, I always, if I'm arguing with someone, I like to just imagine that I really don't like them in some particular way, and then you're just bloody brilliant, mate. But
he suggested he didn't like my sideburns.
Yeah, I did say that.
I'm just going to focus on that for the whole talk.
But here's the problem. But I do have a problem with it, and I have a problem with this whole idea of effective. And I want to give you an example of why I have a problem with it, and we can have a look at this. Philosophers love the burning building scenario. So you've got 2 rooms, the building is burning, and you can save either the thing in one room or the thing in the other, and that's the choice that you have. So imagine there's a child in one room, and there's a Picasso in the other. The building is burning. Now, the effective altruist could argue that you can sell the Picasso for many millions, and with those millions, give that money to charity, to a malaria net charity, which will then save a great many, on a cost-benefit analysis, will save a great many more children. Okay, so the effective altruist, faced with a burning Picasso and a burning child, might save the burning Picasso. Now, at this point, my sympathy for effective altruists just disappears. And it disappears because I think there really is something that's not factored in here, which is the emotional sympathy, which is absolutely essential, which you have done everything you can to eliminate from our calculations. But I would call the person, and we disagree about this, I mean, I think the technical term for the person that saves the Picasso, and I think this would be a sort of, I think publicly I would get a lot of support for this, maybe not here, but out there, that the technical term for the person that saves the Picasso over the burning child is a heartless bastard. That's my problem with effective altruism. And just to supplement that, if you get rid of, if you try and eliminate that emotional aspect to why people give, I actually think you'd find less people wanting to give. So here's my problem. I think you might be good at the distribution bit, but you might not be so good at the money-raising bit. I mean, the problem is if we all turned over to effective altruism, and it turns out that the pot to be used effectively was considerably smaller because you weren't engaging our sympathies, then actually the problem with effective altruism is it's not being effective. So those are my two anxieties. I've got a number of other anxieties, but the problem one is sympathy. What happened to sympathy, Will?
Let's start with the Picasso child in the burning building. What would you do, Will?
Okay, terrific. So first question is, do you think the lives of African children are less important than the life of that child in the burning building? Okay. Now if the case was one child in that burning building or 1,000 children in the other building.
No, it's not that. It's not that. Don't change the case.
No,
don't change the case.
And Giles, hang on. Yeah, go on, Will. Go on.
Okay, in that case, what ought you to do?
In that case,
what
100 children and a...
Yeah, actually, it'd probably be 1,000 children.
Fine, I would save the 1,000 children.
Okay, in the world we live in, which is a very morally counterintuitive world, it's not a world in which our moral intuitions are well adjusted. There is no difference between that Picasso case and the case where there's 1,000 children in one and one child in the other.
There really is a difference.
Because there are many, many people out there who are effectively in that burning building. They effectively are at risk of dying right now. And you just have a slightly more indirect causal mechanism, which is taking a Picasso and selling it and making $1 million and then giving it. And so those people are far away. And you say that's a lack of sympathy. But actually, it's a more cultivated sense of sympathy. You're just empathizing with the person who's right there in front of you, whereas the person who's willing to reflect on those arguments, they're able to sympathize with people on the other side of the world who are just in need of help. So the answer is, yeah, I would save the Picasso. And I agree that this seems weird, but that's because we're in a very weird world, a world where money is so incredibly powerful.
And can I just ask a question? Do you think, once you've done that, the next day, the front page of The Sun and the Daily Mail are going to think...
And the BBC website, frankly.
And the BBC website are going to think, well done, Will MacAskill, we really like his charity. Do you think your charity is going to be bigged up by your... And as it were, donations are going to pour in on the basis of the decision that you made?
Okay, so there's two things. One is that you're now building more into the case. So, you want to think about what are going to be these long-run effects. But secondly, on the sympathy thing, I actually just disagree that this is going to undermine giving. So I set up Giving What We Can a few years ago, which encourages people to give at least 10% of their earnings. As of today, we've raised $500 million of lifetime pledged donations. And this is set up by a couple of kind of bumbling philosophers in Oxford. It's not like, it's not like we're very skilled marketing people or anything. GiveWell, which is a charity that does evaluation into other charities to find out what are most effective, are now advising a foundation of $8 billion to do more good. The kind of growth of interest in effective altruism is rising and rising. And I think it's precisely because so many people are tired of the same old appeals where, you're just getting these emotive images and people are saying, okay, you should give to this thing and make you feel guilty and you don't know what's happening with the money. Whereas actually having this different voice where you're saying, no, look, we're just really concerned about where I can do the most good. And this all started because I was planning to give away most of my income, and I just want to know that, that £1 million or so that I'm going to give over my lifetime is as well spent.
We're talking about evidence. Giles, what evidence do you have that Will saving the Picasso over the child in the burning building will actually mean the number of donations to Will's charities will go down? Is that just your instinct?
Who'd save the Picasso? Hands up.
Well, I was going to say that.
Who'd save the burning child? I don't know what to say.
These are human beings, Will, I suppose, is the issue, isn't it? And human beings don't operate on rational calculus.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, but there's just two different questions, which is like, well, what's actually correct, and then what should you go around kind of promoting? So maybe you, for example, are in favor of just open borders between states. You just think all refugees should be let in. But you might think, look, you just shouldn't promote that because no one's, people are going to find that too radical instead if you advocate for an incrementalist policy. That's fine, but that doesn't, if we're going to have a debate about whether open borders is true, then let's just put the kind of strategic or marketing issues.
But you use the word effective, and my thing is that the people who give, for good or ill, are not beings that make that cost-benefit analysis. You might think that they should be, but they don't make that cost-benefit analysis. They actually give out of other reasons. So if there's the my charity and the your charity simply uses cost-benefit analysis. My charity may not give to the most effective causes, but as it were, has a greater emotional appeal such that more people would give to it, and thereby there will be more money to go round for effective charities and not so effective charities. If that was the choice between us, then surely you would have to say that my more emotional charity was the more effective charity.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it was a choice, so again, we're trading thought experiments because we're both philosophers, even if you turned your back on philosophy, sadly. You should come back to the fold. You're pretty good. No. So, okay, we've got two charities. One is going to be very effective, but let's say it'll be very small because it just can't get in the funding. One's going to be less cost-effective in terms of dollar per amount of good you do, but will be much, much larger because so many people get involved. If it's a question of which charity should you set up, then yeah, you should set up the more emotionally impressive one, because then you're just going to do more good. But that's just a separate question from where ought I to give. If I'm then thinking where should I give between these two charities, I should give to the one that does the most good per dollar. And so it's just we need to keep these questions separate.
But you must agree, Giles, that the play pump example in the book
Nonsense,
is that notion that it was emotional, celebrities got involved, Bill Clinton was backing it, it was very easy for the media to digest, it pulled on all the emotional strings that were necessary. It was completely ineffective.
So Will is 99% right about all of this. This is why it's hopeless to argue with him. He's like so mostly right. People give to the most ridiculous causes, and we absolutely need Will to come in and throw a bucket of cold water over us and actually say that we must be rational, engaged, and look at outcomes when we give to charity. Absolutely right. But there is that bit of me that thinks that Will's just hard-headed utilitarianism on this fails to factor in the fact that the people who give are human beings, and that human sympathy is a part of who we are, and that I think that despite your 100-to-1 example, 1,000-to-1 example, I think that we are not that sort of thing. Is that we are the sort of thing that where the immediate and the present has a call upon our sympathies, which can't survive your cost-benefit analysis. I mean, in your terms, my position is completely untenable. But I suspect that my position is even more, would it be even more popular than the little poll that we did here? Is that there's something, that even you would be going, that, in that situation, there would be something in your head that's going, I don't know what this is, but this feels damn wrong as you're pulling the Picasso out of the burning building.
Okay, terrific. So just one clarification thing, which is you mentioned utilitarianism. I want to be absolutely clear that effective altruism and utilitarianism are two distinct things. So utilitarianism is the view you just ought always to maximize the amount of happiness you can produce. And that says two really controversial things. One is that the ends always justify the means. So if you can kill one to save 5, you should do it. And that secondly, there's no kind of realm of just your own life and personal autonomy. So you should just keep giving until you are just absolutely at the poverty line. Whereas effective altruism is just saying, give at least a significant proportion. This should be a core part of your life. It doesn't have to be all of it. And secondly, doesn't necessarily say that the ends justify the means. Of course, there's going to be a difficult question about where you draw the line, but that's a bit distinct. In terms of going back to sympathy, because that's the important point. So absolutely, I agree that even in the case of taking the Picasso, it's kind of this horrific thing. But I think that horror stems from the world we live in. So in the book, I give the story of James Orbinski, who later became the president of Médecins Sans Frontières. And he was working in Rwanda, and there was a huge wave of casualties from the Rwandan genocide. And vast numbers of casualties. He clearly couldn't help everyone, but they were all there in front of him. And what did he do? Well, he was a good doctor. He engaged in triage. And actually, because logistically it was so difficult, he even had to go to writing the numbers 1, 2, and 3 and putting them, attaching them to different people. So 1 meant to eat immediately, 2 meant leave for later, and 3 meant irretrievable. You just couldn't help this person. And that's an absolutely horrific thing to have to do. But when we look at that case, we think, well, that's horrific because of the nature of the environment he was in. And it's much better that he did that than that he just helped whoever was in front of him or whoever he felt most emotionally attached to. And it's a really sad fact of the world that we're in that same sort of situation. The stakes are almost as high, even if it's not as salient to us. And so the question is, of course we should be sympathetic, and of course the reaction to save the person who's right there in front of you is an admirable reaction, a very human reaction. But then the question is, how are you channeling that in what is a very unjust world?
Will, let's go through some of the examples you have in your book. That's one of them, and there are myriad examples, a lot of them controversial in what you might describe as headline terms. So buying sweatshop goods is a good thing. Mm-hmm. So talk us through. I'm sure a lot of people in here would be horrified at the notion of buying clothing, for example, from a company that was revealed to be running or getting their product from sweatshops in Bangladesh, for example. Now, you make, again, what some might describe as a counterintuitive argument about this. Take us through that.
Okay, so I think a lot of people, sweatshops and ethical consumerism gets a lot of attention. And what's absolutely true is sweatshops are just really horrific places. Absolutely no one denies that. They're just, the working hours are very long, often dangerous. They're very unpleasant environments. The question, though, is if you boycott sweatshop-produced goods, are you benefiting those people by doing so? And if you want to answer yes, then you're implicitly thinking that's because they'd go off and get some other job, some better job if they weren't employed by the sweatshop. But sadly, that's just not the case. Firstly, the wages in these places are just much higher than they would otherwise be taking. If you interview people at work there, they say, yeah, the conditions are hot, but at least it is a job. My alternatives are unemployment, far more arduous, backbreaking farm labor, scavenging, prostitution. And so if you boycott sweatshop-produced goods, then all you're doing is taking away the best working opportunity that these people in very poor countries have. And I think, again, the reason that this is so confusing for us is just because it's really almost impossible to imagine how extreme poverty is. So the poorest billion people in the world live on less than £1 a day, where that means what £1 would buy in the UK. It already takes into account the fact that money goes further overseas. And sure, the world in which we're employing people in sweatshops is really not a world that we want to end. It's not a world we want to have. But the solution to that is to end the underlying poverty. It's not to take away the best opportunities they currently have.
Now, Giles, do you find that argument? I mean, Paul Krugman, no less, eminent economist, said that sweatshops were tremendous good news for the very reasons that Will posits there. But again, the emotional response, Giles, which is where you put on the table this evening, would be, I don't want to do that. I don't want to buy stuff from people who are forced to work in terrible conditions for 14 hours a day, because people don't probably know that the alternative is possibly worse.
Yeah, no, I mean, on this example, I find it more persuasive. But my problem here switches to another sort of problem, which is the sort of political quietism, you might want to say, about effective altruism, which there may be people who say, the problem here with a world that has sweatshops in and so forth is a problem with global capitalism, say. And that actually what would be a more effective way of dealing with this long term is to challenge political structures. Now, I don't know how your analysis adjudicates between me giving my money to an effective charity and me giving it to, as it were, a political advocacy organization that tries to challenge now we're getting into obviously very complicated areas of political difference and disagreement, but actually there will be people who will think that that's really what's the problem here.
Right. Yeah, so I'm quite open to political ways of doing good. So, for example, something where we're both in favor of increased amounts of labor mobility across countries. This is an incredibly, potentially an incredibly powerful way to improve people's lives, because you can people can leave countries where they're incredibly disempowered, don't have any opportunities to be productive, go to a much more productive environment at what is actually just either small cost or small benefit to the receiving country. So there's definitely potential to maybe do even more good through political change. There, though, you have to think a few things. So one is you're much less likely to have an impact. Sure, the impact's going to be greater, but you are much less likely. And so there's going to be this difficult weighing between just how good do you think this would be if you were successful, and how likely is it that you are going to be successful? And maybe that will work out actually that you should do it, but also maybe not. And I think it's at least unclear. Second, though, is like if you are going to focus on political issues, a good heuristic, I think, is what I call pulling the rope sideways. So loads of things involve this political tug of war. So if you wanted to change the abortion debate in the US or something, it's just already so many vested interests, it seems very unlikely that you're going to make a difference on that. Whereas if you're talking about the use of metrics within DFID, then there's not so much political disagreement there. You've got much greater potential to actually have an impact. And so in terms of the policy...
So it's the middle management approach to... you just lost your ambition there. You just lost your ambition to change the world. It's something...
just about taking the most effective means to that. So it's pointless...
But what happens if the problem is systemic, Will?
But I think I think immigration is a systemic thing, and maybe we should push on that. I think if the stakes are high enough, then we should push on it.
There is an argument. I think there is an argument which I think Giles does touch on here, which is about democratic control and what you're actually trying to alleviate. Throughout the book, you really are often talking about the alleviation of extreme poverty, which is really the driving force about what effective altruism might be about. But of course, other people in this audience and in the country and around the world at large may have other priorities, that actually it is about supporting their local hospice, and localism is very important and part of sort of human society. And also, under your method, isn't there a danger that we kind of treasure what we can measure, and stuff that we can't measure, we therefore think, well, that can't be effective, or we don't know whether it's effective, therefore we won't do it. So things like localism, like community, like some senses that economists find difficult to judge, therefore fall out of this effective altruism. Is that a danger?
Yeah, I'm definitely the first to agree that we want to be careful with this lovely slogan, treasure what you can measure, because for sure, so things like biomedical research spending, very difficult to measure the impact of that, but clearly doing huge amounts of good, potentially other forms of systemic change as well. And in the book I talk a bit about this, about how we can still potentially have some sort of framework. So with respect to cause areas outside of global poverty, I ask these three questions. Firstly, how good would this be if you were successful? Secondly is, how tractable is this? How fast can you make progress on this? And thirdly, how neglected is it? So is it an area that already has lots of people focused on it? And if something does very well in those three dimensions, then potentially it's something that you could reasonably think is going to do even more good than these easily measurable things. But I think the key is not to go, people often want to vacillate between either just going with the numbers or saying, well, anything counts then. And that's definitely not what gets entailed. You can still have a very rational approach to this, even if you're not merely going with numbers. So you mentioned localism, for example. And I think just any sort of argument, unless you're just saying, I think the lives of people in my home country are more important than the lives of people elsewhere, unless you're willing to say that, then the argument for donating locally...
Is that an instinct that is reasonable? People might say a lot of charitable giving, the argument is that we do too much abroad, therefore we should do more at home, so to speak. I'm sure the argument is similar across many particularly developed countries. Is that a reasonable proposition?
Yeah, so I think there we're going to get into moral philosophy rather than facts, or empirical facts. And then I just think...
But it touches again on Giles's point, because it might spark greater giving, a greater propensity to give, if you believe it is going to a local charity, whatever we may
Yeah.
think of the moral position,
Okay.
but it gives a greater propensity to give because people think, well, it's going to my local community, which I think
So-
is very important.
So it might spark a greater propensity to give, but to outweigh the difference in impact, it would have to be vastly greater. So in my book, I talk about the income disparity. So we in this room, actually just today I was talking about how if you wanted, you could trick an audience by saying, should the richest 10% in the world all donate 10% of their income? Doing so would eradicate extreme poverty. And everyone would say, yeah, yeah. And then I reveal you're all in the richest 10% of the world's population already. So globally, we are exceptionally wealthy. We're, in financial terms, 100 times richer than the very poorest people in the world. And that actually means that you can do, economists have looked at how money changes into improvements to people's lives. Obviously, the more money you have, the less of an impact you have. And you will do 100 times as much to benefit the very poorest people in the world as you will do to benefit someone in a rich country like the UK or US if you're spending your money. So if it was to spark more giving, it would have to be at least 100 times as much, and that seems very unlikely.
Just before I start bringing the audience in, well, I just want to ask you, there's lots more great bits in your book, but I just want to ask about Fairtrade.
Yep.
It's rubbish. Discuss.
Yeah.
Back to the studio. No, Will, give us a little bit more than yes.
So ethical consumerism in principle could work well. I don't see any theoretical reasons against it. But Fairtrade, I think, is just a bad implementation, sadly. And this is for a few reasons. So one is that of the markup you pay on a Fairtrade good, a very small proportion of that actually goes to the producers. That's because companies use Fairtrade as a way of doing price discrimination. Being able to buy Fairtrade is kind of like this luxury, and they're able to therefore charge more. So it's actually only something like 4 or 5% of that additional markup goes to the consumers. And then within that, only a small amount actually gets passed on to the farmers, the poorest people that we're actually trying to benefit. And in fact, in the best study on this, there was just no difference in income between workers at Fairtrade farms versus non-Fairtrade farms. And then there's two more things. One is that Fairtrade licenses are hard to get. That means that the vast majority of Fairtrade producers are in middle-income countries, Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, rather than the very poorest countries like Ethiopia and Kenya. And then finally, Fairtrade did this thing that just baffles me, which is that the way they tried to get more money is to put a price premium. So whatever the market price is for coffee, they will give the producers a certain amount more than that market price. And then that just means that coffee gets oversupplied. Non-Fairtrade producers can't compete, and they get harmed. So in principle, ethical consumerism could work, but it's just a bad implementation, I think.
Giles, this was one of the most depressing parts of the book.
Well, it is depressing
I could buy, ludicrously expensive bananas and
very
then feel
depressing.
quite happy that I live in, North London and hang out
understand.
at kind of posh restaurants because I was absolutely fine because I bought those bloody bananas.
Yeah.
He's completely undermined my argument, and now I've got to go and buy some other blessed bananas
Or
somewhere
not
else.
at all. You see, this is part. So here's my worry. If you convert everybody, Will, that's great. Your way of doing things, great. But I think there's some sort of tipping thing here which really worries me. Which is, I can imagine a lot of people coming away from hearing a Will MacAskill presentation, going, all that good stuff we do that only does 4 or 5% is bollocks. It's all rubbish. Don't do it. And that's what they take away.
Luckily, we're not broadcasting this live, Giles.
Yes, no.
On Radio 4.
It is live.
Oh, okay.
It's just rubbish. It's just absolute rubbish. And that's what people take away. And then they'll forget the other harder bit, and they won't progress onto it. And though I sort of, this is all, for me as much as other people, I'm listening to this going, that's a really interesting thing, and it is a really interesting thing, I'm still worried that you may disparage without...
Yes, the Council of Despair, Will.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things. One is just that I think if something's true, then it's kind of important to say. And in general, we should be pretty wary about giving misleading messages or misleading people in order to for this idea of the greater good. I think the history of that with charitable fundraising is very bad because people naturally get very annoyed. Yeah. When I was a fundraiser, I was one of those annoying chugger people who pester you on the street. So I apologize to anyone who's had that experience. But I remember telling people you could save a life for 20 pence by purchasing a polio vaccination. And it's could only in the sense that if you buy a lottery ticket, you could become a millionaire. And it's not surprising at all that people just lose all faith in the charitable sector. But then the second thing is that there is an alternative. So with Fairtrade, the alternative is don't worry about Fairtrade, and instead buy whatever goods you want, or even better, whatever goods are cheapest, and then increase your level of donation instead. Because Fairtrade goods are more expensive than non-Fairtrade goods. You have the option, if you really care about people's incomes, you can give directly, or so Give Directly just directly transfers cash to the poorest people in the world. It's an incredibly well-evidenced program. I don't believe it to be as effective as the health programs I've talked about, but it will double a household income. They generally spend that money on assets, tin roofs, livestock, and so on, and generate significant revenue into the future. You're just going to have a far bigger impact in terms of people's lives.
One more point, Giles, then questions.
So one of the best
forest of hands I want to see.
One of the great counterintuitive things that you have to say, Will, we haven't touched on, is don't go into the charity sector, don't go be a priest or anything like that. It's like go and work for Goldman Sachs and then give a higher percentage of your income away to charity, and you'll be doing more good if you're working for Goldman Sachs and giving more money away than you would than working in going and being a charitable worker in Africa or something like that. Now, of course, we get it in terms of pounds, shillings, and pence. Absolutely get that. But again, this seems to be a sort of myopia about the nature of the human person here. That actually this mythical, Goldman Sachs giver, no, they're not mythical. I think I'm sure that they exist, yeah. but they
Goldman Sachs bankers or Goldman Sachs bankers that give money.
That give us. Yeah. I'm sure there are Goldman Sachs bankers that give very generously. Of course, that's right. But the idea that you have a sort of scale where you come out with this interesting counterintuitive thing where, the Goldman Sachs banker is considerably better, doing more effective work. It is about a diminution of the wells of sympathy that we normally draw upon when we give. And though I get the rational case for this, I think there are so many unexpected consequences in saying we should all go and be Goldman Sachs bankers and give to charity. That's what I should be telling my daughter to do if she wants to do good.
Well, 2 sentences, and I mean that. Then now, who's over here for questions? 2 sentences, Will, carry on.
So the quick thing there is just, I think you can do good in a wide variety of career paths. Example of someone who has pursued this was thinking about doing a philosophy PhD, but actually much preferred working in finance, worked in quantitative trading, in an area of finance that I think is socially valuable rather than harmful. I wouldn't be nearly as keen on someone going into Goldman unless they were going to do some sabotage. And so I think that...
we apologise to anybody who's from Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
I kept a completely neutral face there. I hope everyone noticed.
And so, I think these kind of personal factors are important. And earning to give, which is the approach I recommend, is one path among many. Currently, no one does it, and I think it's important. But it is not the only one.
Great. Gentleman there, and then gentleman here at the front, and then the chap there. Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Stand up and say who you are.
I'm Amala Vajra. I'm a fundraiser. And the thing I'm really interested in is your...
For whom?
A Buddhist organisation called True Ratna Buddhist Community.
Right.
We've got a Buddhist centre in London here. The thing I'm really interested in is your 10% giving idea, which you haven't talked about so much, and it seems like that really does make the emotional case very strongly, as well as the rational case for giving in terms of impact. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about that, about why, well, in a way, make that call for why we should be giving more as a percentage of our income, because the numbers that you started with of 10 billion are not actually that much per person in this country. I think it's just a few £100.
Okay, fabulous. Chap here, I'll take 2 or 3 just to kick us off. This gentleman here. Yes. Hang on, wait for the mic. Fabulous.
Hi, Damien Kilman.
From?
From Dudil. I was wondering, you talk about treasure what you measure. What are the time horizons for measurement? Because a lot of these things that have an impact will also have a reaction. So how do you measure and what time horizon is an acceptable time horizon?
Excellent. There's a chap just behind you, and that'll be the first three. Thanks. We'll have hands here next. And there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Mark Goldring. I'm the Chief Executive of Oxfam.
Yes, excellent.
And I was keen to reflect and ask, because there's a huge amount in what Will's been promoting that I see already doing a great deal of good. That sense of people asking harder, really wanting reports on impact rather than PR stories, and people getting behind that, and that itself creating more momentum to give. Where I want to challenge is on two fronts. The first is that I've worked in many countries, and if I just take one example from two countries, you can get children who are not in school into school a hell of a lot more cheaply than you in, say, a middle-income country like Bangladesh than you can in a desperately poor country like South Sudan. Now, the analysis says give your money to Bangladesh, but people in Bangladesh are just that one step closer to climbing out of poverty, whereas those people in South Sudan are not going to get anywhere without your help. So this kind of cost-benefit analysis risks walking away from that, and I'd like to hear your thought. But my most fundamental point is that the very practical approach, such as malaria bed nets, is really good as one element of bringing about change. But those people who have bed nets will still have no fresh water, they'll have no antidiarrheal drugs, but most importantly, they'll have a really weak health system. So you can move on from your issue around malaria to the next disease, but that doesn't bring system change. It doesn't tackle the causes that are keeping people poor. And so if you look at those big issues that have changed public health, they've actually been when governments have started responding to citizens, when tax has been paid, when public services have been well run, when antiretrovirals have come down in price, all those kinds of things. So I do appreciate that you did say that lobbying, campaigning, policy change was not contrary to the philosophy, but it doesn't fit into it very easily. And I think it's that we're going to need if we're going to take 1 billion people out of poverty, rather than give 1 million people better bed nets.
Yeah. Mark, can I just ask you before you sit down? The charitable sector, Will's big point is that the charitable sector has failed in giving the public evidence, proper evidence, not just feel warm evidence, about what it does. And there has been a failure of the whole sector in that. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
I think it's an absolutely fair challenge, which is why I welcomed the prompts.
Is it a fair criticism?
It is of some charities. I mean, as Will himself says, Oxfam publishes effectiveness reviews of our work on our website. So it's not the PR, it's we set out to do this, did we do it or didn't we do it? But that's not the standard way that any charity communicates with the public. So the movement that Will is rightly challenging will improve charities and will it improve charitable giving. I really commend it. I just don't agree with applying it, as it were, pound for pound, because sometimes I want to support those children in South Sudan just as much as the children in India.
Mark, fabulous. Thank you very much. So, Will, in order, 10% giving, why?
Terrific. So, as for the question of why 10% rather than the higher number or lower number, it's obviously just this balancing act. If you encourage people to give 1%, well, they're already giving that anyway, so you're not going to get people to make a difference they wouldn't have otherwise had. If you try and get everyone to give away most of their income, people aren't going to listen to you. 10% is just this nice round number kind of in the middle. In terms of why do that, well, it's because we have this amazing opportunity. So simply in virtue of being born into one of the richest countries in the world, we have this tremendous ability to do good. So let's bring up a burning building again. Imagine, forget about the Picasso. Imagine you're just walking past that burning building, and you see that child in there. You run in, you kick the door down, take that child and drag it out from the flames. That would stay with you. I mean, that would be a special day. Imagine if you did that happen to you several times. You save, once it's from a burning building, another time it's from someone drowning, you take a bullet for someone else. You'd think that you had this really pretty special life. Well, what the numbers show is that just by donating £2,000 to Against Malaria Foundation, to that guy over there, Rob Mather, who's in the room, you can save a child's life. That means that pretty much every single year of your life, you can do as much good as saving that child from that burning building. And when those are the facts, that's just amazing. That's obviously we should be doing this. It seems trivial. It's going to lead to, as well as the good it can do, it's going to come at basically no sacrifice to yourself.
How long to measure was the second question.
How long to measure,
how do you test yourself on measurement, and for how long? Because it was interesting, your Kenya example about education, they did test the notion of giving textbooks, and found that actually deworming was a much greater effect because children actually could go to school rather than being off ill for large chunks of the year. But obviously, one would hope, as the deworming has great effect, the giving out of textbooks and improving the number of teachers might be the next stage. And actually, your support might change from deworming charities towards maybe charities that support the giving of textbooks. I don't know. But how long do you keep those measurements going?
Okay, so I think a really good point here is just that a lot of the cases the measurements are too short. Or it would be really nice to have much longer term measurements for a lot of these trials that we rely on. And deworming is actually kind of an exception in this regard, that we do have evidence from a decade later they've actually followed up with people. And that's part of what makes the case for deworming so strong, much stronger than for other areas. And so, in principle, measurement, we want that to go out just till the end of the human race, or till the stars die away. We just want it to go on forever. Obviously, that's not possible in principle. So if we are doing programs that we can measure, then we want to try and get as long-term perspective as possible. But it is the case that often you just need to focus on shorter-term proxies.
And Mark's point that on cost-benefit analysis, what he describes as middle-income country, Bangladesh, will get more support than the poorest residents of South Sudan.
Great. So, a few things to say. So one is that, Oxfam's, especially in recent years, absolutely great in publishing evaluations of what it's been doing, including, and this is something we should really applaud it for, evaluations showing that the programs don't work. If a charity says they've evaluated a program, it didn't work, that increases my confidence in the charity rather than decreases it, because they're being transparent. Where I'd like Oxfam to go even further is not just evaluating things after the fact, but strategically making decisions of, look, we know that this is an area with really great evidence behind it, and that therefore we're going to focus on that rather than focusing on causes for other reasons. In terms of focusing on the poorest, I think there's a couple of things with the South Sudan example. One is just, so in general, you're almost always going to be focusing on the very poorest people in the world, if you're thinking about who to benefit. Precisely because just money does less good. So it's quite an unusual case if it were the case that you should focus on Bangladesh rather than South Sudan. Though I agree that, that it could turn out that way. But we'd all want to agree with that. If you can save one life in South Sudan or 100 people in Bangladesh, again, to use these simplified examples, then obviously you should save the 100 lives. You wouldn't want to privilege people in one country rather than another. It is true that in certain failed states, maybe it's just really nothing we can do at the moment in Democratic Republic of Congo. And there you just have to wait for things to improve before it's, things could at least potentially be so bad.
You need some civil society.
That's right.
To exist as an institution.
To have an impact. And that's would be a very sad state of the world indeed. Then, sorry, the final question Mark asked was just about, again, systemic change and campaigning and so on. And there again, perfectly possible in theory. One issue is just we really don't know what the causes of poverty are. Economists study this for decades, and there's still just very violent disagreement about it. And that's going to be a challenge. So I'm all in favor of trying to improve regulations. If you could have something like removing the common agricultural subsidy, the fact that the EU and the US and Japan all subsidize their own production, That's, there's quite a lot of agreement there that that's bad. Not actually even bad for the home countries, but put that to the side. But certainly very bad for the poor. If we have the opportunity to change that, then absolutely we should go ahead with it. Other things get very more complicated. And one thing we should worry about a little bit as well is, if you're giving someone health, that's one of the bases of self-respect. It's one of these things that everyone wants. Whereas if you're going and trying to change someone's political systems, then you're starting to interfere with national autonomy. And so there's some reasons there for being a little bit more wary as well. But in principle, I'm open to many of these things.
Giles.
Will, you just said something really interesting. You said, we don't know what causes poverty. If we don't know what causes poverty, how do we know when we're measuring the right things? Because you talk a lot about measuring. Measuring is really big for you. It's an alien idea for me. But it's big and important thing for you. But how do you know you're actually measuring the things that are appropriate to finding out about poverty if you don't really know what causes poverty?
Yeah, so one question is, do we think that aid will have a long-run effect on economic development? And in terms of high-quality evidence, we actually just don't know. Basically, we just don't have the statistical power to be able to tell. Aid is just such a tiny proportion of income going into countries that it's not something we can measure in that way. And so you've got to just use, well, there's two things. Firstly, even if it didn't have a long-run effect on economic development, saving a child's life, I think, is still extremely important. I think the direct benefit is still very important. And then secondly, just kind of using common sense. Like if you you look so shocked at the idea of common sense.
Well, I just suddenly...
Well, Will, I can understand that. Common sense is not empirical, is it?
So common sense is the one thing that you've been departing from. So suddenly to return to it, it's just the point at which I do feel quite shocked about your position, that somehow underpinning it is a return to common sense.
Well, I think common sense is of some value. It's just not the be-all and end-all, which is what sometimes portrayed as. And so, if you're preventing someone from suffering from malaria or suffering from worms, or if you're providing someone with more money to invest in a tin roof rather than a thatched roof that they have to replace every 2 years, it would be kind of surprising if that didn't have longer-run economic benefits.
And that's just the immediate. I mean, you're doing a version of what I did with the Picasso. You're just doing the immediate thing. You can immediately save. Here, I can measure it. I think,
Giles, what is it's not binary. It's not all one or all the other, but that there should be a move on the dial towards what Will is arguing, not getting rid of.
Then we have
everything.
no disagreement.
Well, we have lots of disagreement.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point that Will is making.
I'm not sure it is.
Okay. Let's have some questions. There's a lady here at the front, and another lady just at the back there, and a gentleman behind her. Yes, madam. Well, we'll take this one first. Yeah, then that one. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Elena from Ashoka, a network of social entrepreneurs. I guess my question is building on the one about the timeline. How can you factor in things like climate change? So let's say we save all these children with bed nets, but then they die from a drought in 100 years, or let's say 50 years. Or maybe the climate changes so that there's more mosquitoes. And if so, wouldn't we do better by stopping to harm before doing good? E.g., all of us in the room, shouldn't we maybe de-invest money or fly less or eat less meat or whatever has an effect and take responsibility for our actions before giving money?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A lady back there? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Phoebe. I'm a management consultant. I don't work at Goldman Sachs, but it's sort of close. And William, you may be...
Who do you work for?
I work for Bain & Company. And when I did the 80,000-hour career test, it told me that I should be a management consultant, so I was very happy to learn that. My question is whether the effective altruism philosophy has anything to say about giving in kind, so giving skills or time, and what you might recommend, I suppose. Thanks.
Great. And there's a gentleman behind with his hand up. Yeah, sir.
Hi, my name's Crispin Kelly. I'm an architect. I'm interested in the sort of philosophical background to William's position about altruism as a part of the human condition, whether you believe in that we are altruistically, that we behave altruistically, or is it just a practical approach that you're taking?
Great, lovely, thank you very much. So, are there some things that are just so big we should just be dealing with them, like climate change?
Okay, great.
Frankly.
So, yep. So climate change is obviously a very important issue. Then, yeah, there is this difficult question when the main damages are going to be long in the future. How to prioritize that with immediate helping people now. And economists have done like huge amounts of work now on this. And the metric they tend to use is the social cost of a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, where the idea is if you're emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide or the equivalent amounts of methane or nitrous oxide or other greenhouse gases, how much is that damaging everything you care about, like kind of economy as a whole? And so that's kind of some metric. There's an awful lot of disagreement about it. But I think, and the conclusion I at least came to, being very concerned by climate change, was that ultimately you were going to be able to do more good by helping the poorest people now, rather than via climate change mitigation. I mean, there's 2 ways of making an impact via climate change mitigation. One is, again, going the political route, very hard to quantify, very hard to make estimates about. There, my reticence is just the kind of track record. It's an extremely crowded area, so the difference you're going to make on the margin is maybe smaller. Track record isn't so great. And then secondly is just by doing things, again, that are going to have a measurable impact on the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. There, I think the charity Cool Earth, which deliberately protects parts of the Amazon rainforest from illegal logging by working with local communities and giving them resources to buy the land. There, that will prevent a ton of carbon dioxide emitted for about £3, by my estimate. Again, once you kind of go through all the numbers, I think that's just going to not have nearly as much of an impact as focusing on the poorest people now. Because we are making astonishing progress with respect to extreme poverty. The people who are going to be really harmed from climate change are not as poor as the poorest people now, at least given our best guesses. So it's something that's open, but yeah, I think
you put
unlikely
poverty
to be
first.
That's my best guess, is poverty
yeah.
first. You might think don't do harm first, in which case that's quite sympathetic, in which case I'd encourage just offsetting your emissions via Cool Earth.
You talk in the main about donations. What about the giving in kind, skills, volunteering, giving in other ways? How effective can that be, and does that have to pass the same tests?
Okay, terrific. Yeah, so I think actually this is just as important as giving money as giving your time. Though I think that the main way you should think about that is in terms of your career. So I have this charity, 80,000 hours, named after the number of hours you'll typically work in your life. It's this huge decision. It's of huge importance to the world to ensure you spend out those hours on things that do more good rather than less. And there's been very little attention before we came along to this idea of what will make the biggest impact. And I think people often don't think about it that well. And that doesn't just mean earning as much money and donating. I think you can do huge amounts of good through entrepreneurship, both non-profit and for-profit, politics, research, and just working for very valuable organizations. In terms of volunteering, though, I think things are quite a bit harder. And the reason is that by volunteering, you're often imposing a cost on the charity. Namely, you have to be managed. And you're maybe adding things that you're not particularly skilled in as well, so maybe that's kind of harder. It's also harder to volunteer for international development charities rather than something locally. There are exceptions to this, so if you're doing fundraising, or say working for the Oxfam store, which is quite similar to fundraising, that can be an exception. Some charities are very well set up for taking volunteers, especially advocacy organizations. So I know vegetarian advocacy organizations that make great use of volunteers. But very often you're providing much less of a benefit by volunteering for an organization than you would be if you were, say, working that extra hour and donating. And anecdotally, at least, I've heard of that charities take volunteers because those volunteers are subsequently more likely to donate to the charity rather than because of the benefit they provide themselves. So I think your time is, to recap, time is exceptionally important. I think the most important thing, though, is to think about that in terms of how could I use my career that's like, most of my working time in order to make a difference, rather than kind of volunteering on the side.
And finally was the human condition and altruism, which I want to bring Giles in on after, Will, you've spoken. But is it part of the human condition to want to, in some manner, do good for other people?
Yeah. There, I just think the answer is yes. So I think, sure, most of the time people are concerned about making sure they have a good quality of life for themselves and their family. But absolutely, people are altruistic. We see it all the time. See it all the time in donations to charity and people getting involved in politics and going on rallies and helping other people. There's really, very little in the way of kind of arguments for thinking otherwise. And sometimes people say, oh, well, you give to charity, but that's because you want to do it, and that's not altruism. But that's just now playing with terms. Doing something because I want to, if I do something because I want to do it, that's kind of trivially true. If what I want to do is help other people, then that's altruistic. It doesn't mean I'm doing something just to benefit myself. And so, yeah, I think it's absolutely an important part of the human condition. And, yeah, I think, we should just be pitching arguments in terms of, look, this is just a way of doing good, rather than always trying to cater to donors or cater to people saying this will benefit you as well.
Giles, part of the human condition, altruism?
I have a different anthropology, I guess, to Will, which is I have a much darker view of the human condition than you do. So I don't think that we're all bursting to do good, and all we need to be is properly channeled in the right direction through rational calculation. I think we're much darker creatures. I mean, we're at the moment, when we go out and read our newspapers, the world is a complicated and difficult place. We're going to be arguing about whether we should bomb Syria tomorrow. We have problems in the Middle East with terrorism. The world is a complicated and dark place, and the idea that we're sort of like slightly happy-go-lucky, decent people who just need to be rationally nudged in the right direction is not what I see when I see people. So, I mean, how that affects your argument, I'm not quite sure, but it seems to me that your argument works terribly well if you assume that people are generally good and just need a bit of guidance. I don't see that when I see people. I see selfishness. I see a desire not to be concerned with the sorts of things you're talking about. It's partly why I'm very reluctant to criticize you, because you're one of the good guys. But the world is a darker and more complicated place, and I'm not sure that your philosophy really works in that sort of world.
Yeah, one more thing on that. So to refine my view, basically I just think people are really malleable. So people can do really awful things if the social setup is right. People can do really amazing things if the social setup is right. I was, convinced of all the arguments that I ought to be doing loads with my life for years, and then didn't do anything about it. And it just took meeting one other person who shared my worldview, which was Toby, who I co-founded Giving What We Can with, and then I was on board. And so it's sure things are a matter of psychological blocks, but or psychological motivations, but that can push us in either direction, I think.
Great. More questions? Gentleman here and gentleman at the back. And a lady there at the back up there. Sir. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with...
Do you want to stand up and say who you are?
Yeah, Luke, sorry, I'm an engineer. Looking at being more effective is a very, it's a sort of a concept that we should look at, but it's very dangerous just to think by pure numbers is the best way to sort of think about it. Like, if you say, well, if you can spend it here, you'll save more money, you'll save more people. It's all about how many people you can save. Some of those people in some of those places, it's not sustainable. The reason why that a lot of the famines are there is you've got to look at that too. So are you perpetuating, by saving masses and masses and masses, what sort of problem would that also lead to? So...
Okay. Yep. Gentleman here at the front. I'm testing the microphone people quite rapidly here. Or a lady there first. Brilliant. Let's have that lady there. Lovely.
I'm just a member of the public, but what I want to...
Unlike us.
And I was just interested now, I think because we're all, well, a lot of us are all swept up thinking, what can we do about the refugees? I mean, how do you find out who's being effective? Who's doing what?
Yep, very good question. Gentleman down here at the front.
I'm Michael Anderson. I chair the Cranfield Trust, which provides pro bono consultancy to charities. My question is, why does Will not able to persuade the UK government to spend our overseas aid budget according to his principles rather than according to politics.
Excellent. So, first question, if I'm right, was this notion that pure numbers, you're saving people on the ground, good thing. But if you're not, maybe again, touching on Giles's arguments earlier, if you're not actually changing the system, is just saving people from sort of immediate death raise problems in terms of, because you're not actually changing the underlying economy of that country? I think was roughly where it was.
I understood the question actually to be about worries about overpopulation, so that people were going to, you were going to have more famine because there was going to be more people. Was that right? Okay, I thought so.
Oh, right, okay, yep.
And so there, I just think a couple of things. So firstly, in terms of the evidence, you tend to not, saving a child's life tends not to really affect the population of the country, because the reason fertility rates are so high in very poor countries is because if you're worried your children, if you think it's very likely that your children are going to die, which is rational to think, then you're going to have more children. And there's this, very, very clear trend between a country being richer than having a lower birth rate. The second thing is just, I think that concerns about overpopulation aren't really borne out, at least not on the kind of margins we're talking about, where having a larger number of people in the country, sure, it places more of a burden on resources, but actually adds resources as well, namely a new person who's able to contribute their labor as well. The population of the world has increased dramatically, as have incomes. So I think actually overpopulation is not the concern that most people have.
Can I ask a supplementary on that? Will? Just you have this quality-adjusted life thing, the quality thing. Does that mean, this is a clarification point, does that mean that a world with 10 million people in it is half as good as a world with 20 million people in it?
Right. So it doesn't mean that. So what we're getting into is the thorny issue of population ethics, which is one of the hardest areas of all of moral philosophy, and basically no one has anything good to say about it. But in
terms of if one unit equals one good thing and 2 units equal 2 good things, then you'd have thought a double of the population equals a double amount of good things on your analysis.
Well, so that's one view. So that's called the total view of population ethics, where you just want as many people as possible because you're just adding to the happiness of the world. Shouldn't laugh, it's an interesting view.
It's rubbish, Will.
The alternative is called person-affecting views. And when person-affecting, so there it's just, it's good to make, morality is about making people happy, not making happy people. So it would be good to add more qualities by extending your life and improving your life, but not by bringing someone new into existence. And that's at least the intuitive view. And that's the view, that's what underlies economic analysis on this as well. So they don't take into account, they don't think of it as a benefit to the person who's come into existence.
Because it would be
Giles, I'm just aware of the time,
Okay.
Will. Refugees, people in here, maybe you do want to make some form of donation or do some effective work to help the refugees crisis. What on earth do they do by the rules of your book?
Great. So I wrote a little bit about this for The Guardian. I actually think in the case of refugees, this is one of the strongest cases, I think, for political action rather than charitable donations. In particular, like funding refugee camps. It's actually, I don't really like this term unsustainable, but it is something that's unsustainable. You have children or people growing up there for 17 years on average. It's not something that's going to contribute to the kind of long-run economic growth. It's not going to solve the problem. In contrast, we do have this potential to radically improve many people's lives by letting people move freely across borders. I mean, and there's, people in this country want to hire people from other countries want to work here. It's a very strange state of affairs where we don't allow that to happen. Imagine if we didn't allow free trade of other goods across countries. We'd think that was insane. And so there, I think that the case for helping refugees via donations isn't that strong. Also, just the cost to sustain someone in a refugee camp is not great, whereas the case for political change, where that's through campaigning and hassling your MP and going on marches, which there is evidence is effective. or does make some difference at least, is actually comparatively strong, because this is, the reason we don't let more immigrants or refugees into our country, it's purely a political one. It's purely a matter of public policy. It's nothing to do with economics. So actually, I think that's what the strongest case is there.
And then the final question, I'm afraid we're slightly defeated by time. The overseas aid budget, the argument was that it is spent for political reasons rather than for effective reasons. I mean, A, do you agree with that? And B, why doesn't the government change that?
Yes and no to agree with it. So some of it is spent pretty well. So I actually have done some advising for the UK government on this. And some of it spent very well, some of it spent entirely for strategic purposes. And so you can make some improvements within the stuff that's spent well, but not like amazing improvements, because they're already spending it on good things in global health and other forms of development. And then the reason why some of it is not spent so well, and why can't we make it better? For the same reasons that it's hard to make change in any sort of politics. There's so many vested interests. And if you were to, and very many people in the country, and including in government, do just want to use foreign aid as a tool for furthering British interests. Thankfully, that was much less common as a view among the people that I've talked to who influence foreign aid. And there actually are a lot of people that really do want to make it used much better, but sadly, they're not the only voices there. And so, yeah, I'd love to see it improved.
Excellent. Just before we finish up with a minute from each of our fabulous panelists, just to sum up where they think the argument has got to, or whether anything has influenced, anyone the other side has said has influenced what they think. I just want to ask the audience, just to give us one last little straw poll. Who in the audience, after listening to, frankly, pretty fascinating debate from these two panelists, thinks they will now change the way they look at donating what money or volunteering they do? Now, that is not a bad effect, Will. Well done. Effective debating. Forget effective altruism. That's very good. Giles, give us 1 minute. We're slightly defeated by time. Give us 1 minute, just summing up where you think this debate is going and some of the key arguments.
Will's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant, and I think he's very persuasive in a whole load of things. Where I become anxious is on the edges of Will's position, and also on its ambition, its potential ambition to describe the fullness of our giving. I think he's a brilliant critic of the way in which we do things, but I wouldn't want you to be in charge of absolutely everything about how we give, because I think there will be all things that would miss out on giving that wouldn't meet your criteria, and I think they're terribly important. And getting to that that's my 10% critique of what you do.
So, Dictator Will. If everyone behaved like you, would it be a huge problem?
It would be great. We'd eradicate global poverty, climate change would be an easy add-on. Okay, my final minute is just that everyone in this room finds themselves in what's probably the richest few percent of the world's population. If you're earning over £30,000 after tax, you're in the richest 1% of the world's population. And we got there by virtue of the luck of being born into a very rich country, not through any sort of hard work. And this is easy to be annoyed by, but it actually gives us the most amazing opportunity. Simply by targeting our time, if that's through our choice of career, or our money through our donations to these very most effective causes. Maybe it's the measurable stuff, maybe it's deworming, maybe it's bed nets, maybe it's some forms of effective political change. We have the power to do an enormous amount of good. You can be that person who saves that child from that burning building every year of your life. You can be a superhero if you want to. It's just up to you whether you want to do it. But I think we should.
Fantastic. I just want to say, thank you very much to Giles Fraser. Thank you very much, of course, to Will MacAskill. Will will be signing copies of his book in the foyer outside for the next half an hour, so start queuing now. Thank you very much to you for coming, and thanks to the two panelists.